I fought for God. Who do you fight for, Exile?
Hello and welcome to another Path of Exile build guide. Do you like the idea of having over 9000 HP, face tanking everything the game can throw at you and then some, blitzing through maps like an unstoppable train and melting everything in sweet delicious fire? And I've got the perfect build for you, the Molten Titan, a combination of two of the most popular and well designed Molten Strike builds out there. Hybrid's take on Jugg Molten Strike and AB's Molten Tank. Here's the high level breakdown of the build's capabilities. It is by far one of the most tanky builds out there. You can reach over 9000 HP with a shield or 8500 while dual wielding. It also has a great deal of physical damage mitigation and huge amounts of life leech and life regen, while also being immune to stuns, freezing or any kind of slows. It has an exceptionally good hardcore character and you will die only if you completely ignore what's happening on the screen. As such, it is also amazing for new players that want to learn the game mechanics and become familiar with the hardest content the game has to offer. A good league starter, it can perform really well with makeshift gear up to mid-tier maps without investing more than a few chaos for each piece. Once you get a few of the recommended uniques, endgame content really opens up and everything is completely doable. There are however a few map modes that it won't be capable of doing or would otherwise cripple the build too much, namely avoid running elemental reflect, no leech and no regen map rolls. So now that you know what you're getting, let's see how exactly you can achieve all that. The guide is divided into 7 main sections: build overview, passive tree and leveling, Ascendancy, Pantheon, gems and links, gear, flasks and jewels, and finally pros and cons. In the video description below you will find a link for importing the entire build guide in the Path of Building tool. It includes the passive tree broken down into level brackets, example gear, and a detailed notes section on gearing, stats priorities and gems. With that out of the way, it is time to lay out the build overview. You will burn your way through the game by using Molten Strike, one of the more interesting attack skills in the game. Each attack with this skill has two components, a melee hit and a projectile attack which spreads magma balls that explode on impact with the target and deal damage in a small area around it. In this particular build we will be focusing only on the projectiles part and we won't scale melee damage at all. Even though the magma balls are considered projectiles, they are of a special type, the so-called ground targeted, as opposed to an arrow-like projectile. As consequence, they cannot chain, pierce or fork and their speed cannot be modified. Point blank however works fine with Molten Strike and we are actually using it to significantly boost our damage. By default, Molten Strike converts 60% of the physical damage into fire damage and afterwards, either through Soft's Blood Amulet or Avatar of Fire passive, we convert the remaining 40% as well. In the end, we will only be dealing fire damage and nothing else. In terms of defenses, this build has a lot of things working together to make you almost unkillable. First, there's the obvious giant health pool, which you can obtain through smart gearing and many increased max life passives. A direct consequence of having a large life pool is a proportionally increased effectiveness of life regeneration, as most such passives or buffs are based on maximum life. The same goes for life leech, whose cap is based on max life as well. And since pretty much nothing can one-shot you, these two will almost instantly get you back to full HP after being hit by anything. We also end up with a large amount of armor, both from passives as well as by converting all evasion rating into it through iron reflexes. Then we add even more physical mitigation through endurance charges, which we are able to generate extremely fast thanks to our Ascendancy. This also enables us to use a maxed out cast when damage taken and immortal call setup, but I'll cover that a bit later in the gem section. The build is highly flexible in terms of gearing. You can dual wield for more DPS or you can go with one hand plus shield for a more defensive approach. You can even switch between them on the fly without having to change anything in a passive tree. Lastly, I should mention that Molten Strike's skill tooltip is unfortunately only showing the DPS for the melee component, as it is practically impossible to pre-calculate the actual damage dealt by the magma balls. You can have several projectiles hitting the same target or a single projectile hitting multiple targets at once. Basically, the game has no way of determining these scenarios ahead of time. Having covered the build overview, it's time to start talking about the passive tree and leveling. The points from Act 1 are spent mostly on life and armor nodes, a solid base to keep you alive as you progress through the story. In Act 2 we balance it out a bit by picking up a few damage nodes as well as some of the quality of life passives, for example removing the movement speed penalties from armor with the help of Art of the Gladiator. In this act you'll also have to deal with the Bandits quest, and for this build the best option is to kill all of them and get the 2 passive points. All could have been tempting if we would be scaling physical damage, but since we're focusing on fire damage instead, the 2 passive points are more valuable. In Acts 3 and 4, we get the life and mana leech nodes to help with both survivability as well as mana sustain, as Molten Strike becomes more expensive with additional support gems. At about this point it is also possible to obtain the first jewel socket, and ideally you should use wildfire for the 2 extra projectiles. This should be relatively cheap if you're not right at the beginning of a league. If not, just postpone getting the socket until you have a useful jewel to put in it. Towards the end of Act 4, you should also grab the Iron Grip keystone, which will apply the damage bonus of strength attribute to projectiles as well. In Acts 5 and 6, the passives are an even split between offense and defense as we invest in notable passives such as Blade Master, Barbarism and Devotion. On top of that we get a second jewel socket, and by this point you should have at least some of them from quest rewards. By leveling through Acts 7 and 8 we get 2 more keystones, namely Avatar of Fire and Elemental Overload. Avatar of Fire is a key element of this build as it helps us to completely convert the physical damage into fire damage on top of the conversion already applied by Molten Strike itself. As for cold and lightning damage, these get a 50% conversion, which means that 10 points of added cold damage will turn into 5 points of fire damage before any other multipliers are applied. This is a very poor rate, so avoid having cold or lightning damage affixes on your gear and instead look for fire or at the very least physical damage. Avatar of Fire also nullifies any chaos damage you would deal and does not convert any of it into fire, so it is absolutely useless from this point onward. The second keystone, Elemental Overload, is a very solid damage boost for this build. As this is not a crit build, we have very little crit multiplier, so the downside is practically inexistent. And while our crit chance is quite small as well, we make up with a very high attack speed, so in practice we end up with an almost permanent uptime of this buff. In Act 9 we go through the awesome Templar starting area, which is full of great notable passives such as Holy Dominion, Divine Fervor and Discipline and Training. They grant us large amounts of damage to accuracy, elemental penetration and elemental damage, as well as a sizable chunk of HP. As we finish Act 10 in the campaign, we get 2 more jewel sockets that should help with patching up any resistance holes or simply for the damage boost. We also finish up with the Templar area by grabbing Retribution and Precision. By about level 80 you should be able to grab the last jewel socket as well as the Berserkering Wheel for additional attack speed. At this point and up to level 90, get the Celestial Judgment notable passive for additional fire penetration and then start working your way through the Scion Wheel of Life cluster. As you get to level 95, there are several viable options depending on what you feel you're lacking, either damage or defenses. Personally, I go with Celestial Punishment notable passive, which I combine with the more advanced gearing and gemming option that I will describe a bit later in the guide. I also take the versatility node that helps with some much needed attributes. Finally, as this is definitely the kind of build with which you can get level 100, you can pick up a few more armor and life nodes along with some chaos resistance. And that's about it for the passive tree and leveling. Up next I'll be covering the Ascendancy class, which makes this build truly shine. As you probably figured out from the title, the Ascendancy of choice is the amazing Juggernaut. Not only does it sound awesome, but it does exactly what it says on the tin, an unstoppable force trampling everything in its path. First points are going in the Unstoppable node, likely one of the best passives in the entire game. Apart from the obvious movement speed bonus, we also get stun immunity. Stuns are probably the #1 reason for dying in harder boss fights. This is especially true for inexperienced players, so having this safety net in place is priceless. Then there are the 2 additional bonuses which might seem a bit redundant with each other, so I'll explain exactly what each of them does. The first one, action speed cannot be modified to below base value, is referring to your character's animation speed, and this is what gets slowed down with effects such as chill, freeze or temporal chains curse. Action speed, however, doesn't have anything to do with attack speed, cast speed or movement speed, which is why the second line of the passive was necessary. I know it's a bit confusing, but that's the wording distinction that the game designers chose to use. What you should take from this bonus is that in effect you become immune to chill, freeze and temporal chains, which is a huge deal especially for mapping or several of the hardest boss fights in the game. The second Ascendancy passive you should take is Undeniable. This will basically take care of all your accuracy problems for the rest of the game and thus freeing up gear affixes for better DPS stats. After completing the Merciless Labyrinth, grab Unflinching for some amazing buffs to generating endurance charges. An endurance charge is a stackable buff that, by default, lasts for 10 seconds and its duration is reset every time you gain a new charge. Each endurance charge provides 4% physical damage reduction as well as all elemental resistances. With this passive you will practically have 4 charges up almost permanently. The final Ascendancy passive is Unbreakable, which will double the armor value you get from the chest piece along with a very large amount of life regen. With the Ascendancy out of the way, we can take a quick look at the Pantheon choices. Generally speaking, Pantheon choices are situational and there isn't a best pair that will outperform all others in any situation. However, there are certain options that complement specific builds quite well in a wide range of situations. For this particular case, here are my recommendations. For the Major God, Soul of Arakali, mainly for the excellent life recovery buff which affects life regen, life leech and even life flasks. This Pantheon has great synergy with a cast when damage taken plus Immortal Call and Blood Rage gem setup, which I will describe in greater detail in the gem section. For the Minor God, a Soul of Tukohama to further boost life regen and additional physical damage mitigation. A good alternative Minor God is Soul of Shakari for poison immunity as well as chaos resistance. Having covered the Pantheon choices, we can now focus on one of the most important aspects of any build, gems and links. Before outlining the actual gem choices, I first need to point out that when it comes to the damage dealing gems, I am always listing them from the highest DPS option to the lowest, so in case you can only get 4 or 5 links instead of 6, just omit the last support gem or gems in the chain. I'll start off with the main setup, Molten Strike and its support gems. First in line is Molten Strike, which will immediately repeat your attacks 2 additional times after they have fired, making it a great support gems for builds which already have a high attack speed. The second gem, Ancestral Call, is a bit of an oddball and might require a bit of practice to use at its full potential. At first glance, it seems somewhat similar to Molten Strike, 2 more attacks launched at 2 additional nearby targets. However, the thing that makes Ancestral Call so powerful is its interaction with large targets such as bosses. Normally, this support gem should not work against single targets as there are no additional enemies around. However, as bosses generally have increased hitboxes, with proper positioning and attacking in place, Ancestral Call will target them as well and spawn additional projectiles from behind the target. Here's a slow motion bit from an Elder fight to better visualize that. As you can see, initially I managed to spawn Ancestral Call's extra magma balls, but then I get too close to the boss and you should be able to notice fewer projectiles. In order to obtain this effect, you need to attack in place and target the ground a slight distance away from the target. It does take a bit of practice and in very hectic battles it might be quite difficult to pull off. In case this seems a bit too gimmicky for you, replace this gem with a fire penetration support. The next support gem down the chain is Elemental Damage with Attacks, a very simple and straightforward gem providing pure extra damage, no strings attached. For support gem is Concentrated Effect. As I mentioned in the build overview, the magma projectiles are dealing their damage in an area around the target they hit. Since this area is quite small to begin with, further lowering it by a third doesn't really affect it much, so it is a good trade-off for a significant damage increase. In the last slot to use Elemental Focus, which grants a large amount of damage but disables Molten Strike's ability to ignite targets. That's not really a concern as we weren't relying on ignite damage or the actual presence of ignite on targets. There is also an alternative setup which was designed by Hybrid in his version of the build, which makes use of an Elder helmet with socketed gems are supported by Immolate and Concentrated Effect. We then add Molten Strike, Multi-Strike, Ancestral Call and Combustion, turning this into a proper 6-link setup. We use Combustion instead of Elemental Focus as in this setup we actually need to ignite the mobs for the damage bonus provided by Immolate. While this variant has slightly lower DPS, we no longer need a 6-link chest piece and we can use Kaom's Heart, greatly increasing our health pool. I'll cover this more in the gearing section so you can eventually make an informed decision on which setup to use. We then make use of a standard 4-link cast when damage taken setup. Since we have such large health pool and we can generate endurance charges really fast, it makes sense to have all the gems in this chain at level 20. The first trigger gem is Blood Rage, a great buff that increases our attack speed and life leech and also generates frenzy charges which further boost our damage. The buff has a base duration of 10 seconds and is refreshed every time you kill an enemy, so its uptime is pretty much permanent. It does have a downside, a physical damage over time debuff, but its effect is completely mitigated by our high regeneration rate. Level up Blood Rage as much as your dex allows you to. The second trigger gem is Immortal Call. This skill will make you invulnerable to physical damage for a short period of time and it is crucial for many situations where you would receive a sudden burst of massive damage. Since we are actually generating a lot of endurance charges, the buff duration is quite significant. As I mentioned a bit earlier, this cast when damage taken setup has a very interesting interaction with Soul of Arakali Pantheon choice. Its second power says that we gain 50% increased life recovery rate if we stop taking damage over time recently. You might already suspect how this trick is going to work. We take enough damage for cast when damage taken to trigger the next gems. Blood Rage goes up and we get a physical dot. Immediately after, Immortal Call fires and the physical immunity prevents this dot from doing damage. Thus we have all the conditions to trigger Arakali's life recovery buff. However, the gems must be in this exact order, cast when damage taken, Blood Rage and then Immortal Call. This is because they are fired sequentially and it would make no sense to trigger Blood Rage after Immortal Call. This is in fact one of the very few instances in the whole game where the order of gems matters. The final gem in this setup is flexible. You can use Lightning Golem for some extra damage, Molten Shell or a curse such as Flammability or Warlord's Mark. If you are using a 6-link chest for Molten Strike instead of the Elder Helmet plus Kaom's armor, then you should have an additional 4-link available. There you can put a second cast when damage taken setup with lower level gems. My recommendation is something as following. The mobility skill of choice is Whirling Blades, which is insanely fast with the high attack speed that this build has. Link that with Fortify support gem for an additional buff of 20% damage reduction from hits. The last gem should be Blood Magic, as we don't have a large enough mana pool to afford spamming Whirling Blades. The build also makes use of two auras. First is Anger, a pretty obvious choice for any fire damage dealer. For the second aura, we can choose between Herald of Ash for a decent fire damage boost, or my recommendation, Vitality, for a sizable chunk of life regeneration. This also becomes extremely potent when paired with the Watcher's Eye Jewel, with life gained for each enemy hit while affected by Vitality. Then link these two auras with Enlighten, which is a special kind of gem that lowers the mana cost of supported gems once it reaches level 2. You should however aim to have at least a level 3 one for a noticeable effect. Finally, depending on whether or not you are using Tomb Fist gloves, you might have another 2, 3 or 4 gem sockets available. Here I generally go with Leaf Slam linked with Blood Magic, as Whirling Blades cannot bypass obstacles and I'm too lazy to go around stuff. In an additional socket I squeeze in Val Haste. While there isn't enough mana to keep the aura active, you can use just the Val part of it for a massive DPS burst. To wrap up this section, here are the gems you should aim to have at 20% quality. Gearing up for this build isn't too difficult and you can easily farm mid-tier maps with an investment of about 50 chaos. Of course, you cannot reasonably expect to kill Uber Elder with that kind of gear, but the more currency you spend, the better you will perform. Starting off with the weapons. While leveling, use any one-handed sword with high fire or physical damage and a fast attack speed. A very good intermediate unique is the Ichimonji, which should be affordable even early in the league and should carry you for quite a while. Once you start farming tier 7 or 8 maps, you should really start looking for a Grelwood Shank, which is practically the best in slot option. Literally everything on this sword is amazing for this build. First, it provides increased armor while stationary, which totally fits Molten Strike's playstyle. Then it gives us 2 additional projectiles if we've been hit recently, which is a huge DPS boost as you should always be in the middle of a pack spreading fiery goodness. Lastly, it provides not 1 but 2 keystone passives, Point Blank and Iron Reflexes. Point Blank greatly increases the damage of the magma bolts at close range, but they get weaker as they travel further. The breaking point is at 35 distance units. Past that, the projectiles deal less damage with Point Blank than they did without, but since we are always in melee range, this is a net buff for us. Iron Reflexes converts all our evasion rating into armor, which is then boosted by the many increased armor passives we've taken up to that point. For the second weapon slot, you can go with another Grelwood Shank for 2 additional projectiles, or what is in my opinion a much better option, the lesser known Beltimber Blade. With this, the 2 additional projectiles are granted if you have used a movement skill in the past 4 seconds. This might seem like a short time frame, but I really cannot think of any fight where you would stand still for more than 4 seconds. Trash mobs die much faster than that, and the bosses aren't just punching bags. You constantly need to reposition or dodge various mechanics, so you use a movement skill. However, the reason why I recommend this is for the far shot keystone passive that it provides. Earlier I said that past 35 distance units, Point Blank lowers our damage, but with Far Shot this is extended to 60 distance units. On top of that, it even further increases the damage in the 0 to 60 range. Here's a great visual aid to better understand all that, thanks to a fellow Path of Exile player. You can also choose to go with the one-handed plus shield route, in which case I recommend either Lion's Eye Remorse, focusing on defenses, or Surrender, which is more of a hybrid option. I also think that Surrender is by far the best looking shield in the game. I mean, just look at it. For the helmet we have broadly 2 options, a standard red helmet with life elemental resistances and some accuracy or missing attributes such as dexterity or intelligence. This should then be paired with a 6-link chest where the Molten Strike setup would go. For lower budgets, a rare one with some life, resistances and increased armor or evasion will do just fine until you can afford the best in slot, a 6-link Lore Weave. On that, the most important stat to look for is maximum resistances are 80%, anything lower than that is suboptimal. Also, most of the other stats on this unique are great for this build and you should aim for high values when possible. Going back to the second helmet option, as I briefly mentioned in the gem sections, you can also go for an Elder helmet with socketed gems are supported by Immolate and Concentrated Effect. Try to get one with Immolate level 20 or at the very least 18. The level of Concentrated Effect doesn't really impact DPS that much, but it's still ideal to aim for level 20. Apart from that, depending on your budget, try to squeeze in as much health, resistances or attributes as possible. This helmet will then hold Molten Strike and 3 other support gems, basically turning it into a 6-link. This frees up the chest piece slot where you can then make use of the excellent Calm's Heart, which will provide an insane amount of health, armor and some additional fire damage. Each of these 2 options has certain advantages and disadvantages. The normal helm plus Lore Weave setup has about 10% more damage and it provides an easier way to cap your resistances and get the necessary dex or int. On the other hand, you get around 1500 less HP, lower physical damage reduction, and it is overall more expensive, especially for the 6-link lore weave. When going with the Elder Helm and Combs, you get better defenses but slightly lower DPS. It's cheaper to buy these, but it is also a bit harder to gather resistances on the other pieces of gear. In the end, it is a matter of taste and preference. Lastly, regardless of which helmet you choose, the best enchant is Molten Strike fires 2 additional projectiles or its cheaper version with only 1 projectile. Basic gloves should be used to fill any resistant gaps or necessary attributes, and ideally some attack speed and physical or fire damage to attacks. For higher budgets you can try to get all these on a gripped gloves base for the increased projectile damage implicit. The best in slot option is a pair of Doomfist gloves with 2 abyssal sockets. Apart from the extra damage and health that the jewels themselves will provide, thanks to those gloves you will apply Intimidate and Maim debuffs on hit, increasing your damage against these targets and slowing them down. However, when using Doomfist it becomes even more difficult to cap resistances and get enough dex or int, but it is not impossible. Entry level boots should have a decent amount of life, resistances and optionally dex or int that you might need. Movement speed is not hugely important as you'll generally move around using whirling blades. We continue our belts with no pants dressing policy, and for the cheaper options you should aim for 70 plus life, resistances and elemental damage with attacks. The best in slot is a Stygian Vice belt with a combination of fire damage, elemental damage and weapon elemental damage as well as life and resistances. The amulet is generally a slot where you mostly get damage. A good starting point should be one with added flat physical and fire damage, life and resistances as well as attributes. The best in slot option is Xop Vlad unique, which grants Avatar of Fire Keystone passive along with a large amount of life and fire resistance. On top of these, enemies that hit you will get covered in ash, lowering their movement speed and increasing the fire damage they take. Once you acquire this amulet, make sure to refund the point invested in Avatar of Fire passive. For the rings you should also focus on damage, but there is one particular affix that should be priority 0, life gained for each enemy hit by attacks. This type of life restoration is instant, and between the 2 rings you should aim to have at least 20 to 25 in total. Considering the very high attack speed and the large number of projectiles, this stat alone will keep you alive through huge amounts of incoming damage. As much as possible, get other damage affixes such as added fire or physical damage along with life and other missing resistances or attributes. Unfortunately, this kind of rings can be pretty expensive, especially if you want other useful stats on them as well. A cheaper and more streamlined alternative is to use a Watcher's Eye jewel with life gained for each enemy hit while affected by Vitality, paired of course with Vitality Aura. This will allow you to get much cheaper rings with great DPS stats such as flat fire and physical damage, elemental damage as well as life and resistances. And while we're on the topic of jewels, we have a total of 5 sockets in the passive tree, along with potentially 3 more with a Stygian Vice belt and Doomfist gloves. As mentioned earlier, one of these should be a Watcher's Eye, granting you life gain on hit. If you're rich enough, you can look for one with an additional anger mode, such as increased fire damage or fire resistance penetration while affected by anger. A second socket should be taken by Wildfire for an additional 2 Molten Strikes projectiles. This jewel should be the very first one acquired. If you cannot buy it earlier, then you can obtain it as a quest reward in Act 5. The last mandatory jewel is a Viridian one with plus 2 mana gained for each enemy hit with an attack, which should take care of all your mana issues. Other stats to look for on this jewel are attack speed, either regular or with swords, increased max life, resistances or attributes. For the other jewel slots, the best options are abyssal ones, especially the Murderer's Eye type. My go-to stats are generally flat life along with 2 flat fire or flat physical damage. Due to the large amount of increased max life percentage nodes from the passive tree, an average roll of let's say 35 flat HP ends up increasing our total life by around 120, so try and get at least some of that on each remaining abyss jewels. The flat fire and physical damage modes can also roll quite large values on higher item level jewels, drastically increasing your DPS. For the flasks we have some pretty straightforward choices. For the healing flask we'll go with Blood of the Karui, as our health pool is simply too large for regular flasks. Up to about 6000 HP you can get away with a normal Eternal Life flask, but I strongly recommend getting the unique one as soon as possible. The second flask should be a Chemist or Ample Sulfur one for a DPS boost. The suffix should be of Staunching for bleeding removal. Third one is a Chemist Silver Flask for the attack speed buff with a wording suffix for curse immunity. Make sure to roll a high enough prefix so it consumes only 30 charges, thus allowing you to use it twice. Then we go for the classic Wise Oak, an excellent 2-in-1 defensive and offensive flask. You need to ensure that fire resistance has the highest uncapped value of all, so the damage bonus applies to fire damage. The last flask is one that seems to have been designed specifically for this build, the amazing Dying Sun, which provides 2 additional projectiles and increased area of effect. If you can't afford the Dying Sun or you're closer to the beginning of a league, then use either a Quicksilver Flask for movement speed or Granite for a large chunk of extra armor. To wrap up the gearing section, here are some excellent leveling uniques that will help you blitz through the campaign. With the gearing out of the way, it is time to take a final look at the pros and cons of the build so you can better understand if it's what you are looking for. Starting off with the pros, it is one of the tankiest and most resilient builds in the game. Generally, you will only die if you make big mistakes or when you're completely ignoring fight mechanics in tough encounters. Excellent hardcore build, especially when using a shield and calms heart. Very beginner friendly, it allows new players to experience content that would otherwise be inaccessible with other builds. It also doesn't punish mistakes, making it a great learning build. It can farm mid-tier maps with low investments and then steadily scale up to red maps. It can currently clear all content in the game, including the toughest boss fights out there. Very flexible in terms of gearing and playstyle. There are multiple available options that perform quite similarly, each offering a different take on the build. One of the best labyrinth farmers out there, you can use it to carry friends or farm expensive enchants and get rich quick. Very mobile, able to blitz from pack to pack and quickly clear maps or delve runs. The cons list is significantly shorter. It is not able to run a few map modes such as Elemental Reflect, No Leech or No Regen. His DPS is not stellar as we traded some of those capabilities for more defenses. You can however have over 1 million Shaper or Elder DPS with good gear. Ancestral Core requires some practice for it to be efficient. It can however be replaced with another support gem for comparable performance.
Learn anything new, Exile?
If you did, then you'll probably be happy to hear that there are more videos coming up in the near future with more exciting builds to try. Make sure not to miss them by subscribing to the channel so you get notified when that happens. And while you're at it, why not like this video as well or drop a comment down below to let me know your thoughts. Thank you all for watching and see you next time.